And we are back with Dr. Lynn Parramore. We were talking economics, and in a sense, we will still be. But Lynn, you recently wrote an article that, look, it was bound to catch anybody's eye, I suppose, and on sex with robots. And by the way, before we go in, I actually know a little bit about this because I'm an affiliated scholar with the Institute for Ethics in Emerging Technologies, which deals with a lot of these issues of technology and humanity in the human future. And I participated in a book of 50 futurists, I think it was, although I don't use that word. So I think it's a fascinating topic, more so than people give it credit for. And it sounds crazy, though. So tell us why you wrote that article and what you thought about the topic.
Yes, well, there's certainly been a lot of hysteria over robots lately. Anytime the economy is doing badly, people become very fearful of robots and afraid that robots are going to be taking jobs and so on. Economists are about split down the middle on whether or not increased robot technology is going to cause a net gain or a net loss in jobs. I tend to be in the net gain category. But the question has arisen if we're going to be socially interacting with robots and perhaps even sexually interacting with them, will they replace sex workers? The whole question of sex with robots sounds like something out of a science fiction movie. I mean, we just had the movie Her, which shows a man having a romantic relationship with a computer operating system, and most people think, well, that's pretty far-fetched. That could never happen to me. But a lot of experts say that in the coming decades, robots are going to become a lot more sophisticated. They're going to be able to respond to and detect human emotions. They're going to understand our speech better and become a lot more like us. And so a lot of them are predicting that sexual interaction, romance, possibly even marriage with robots is on the horizon. And it just raises a host of very fascinating questions about human behavior, perhaps robots having rights, the legal and ethical issues surrounding this. It's just a tremendously interesting topic.
Well, it absolutely is, and not for the salacious reasons that people might think. Philosophically, it raises enormous questions. I did a thing also, by the way, I've found that a lot of people who are very oriented towards this sort of thinking, who, for example, are concerned about the civil rights of potential artificial intelligences. By the way, I'm not sure we'll ever have a true artificial consciousness, but the people who are concerned about that issue, the civil rights of an artificial consciousness, many of them, I did a piece during the break, a news item about the CEO who kicked a dog. Many of them are very equally interested in the rights of what they describe as non-human persons, chimpanzees, dolphins, other intelligent animals. Many animals now show a sense of self-awareness. So there's an intersection, interestingly enough, between the issue of animal rights and the issue of potentially rights for artificial consciousnesses or robots or whatever. But the whole idea of, a guy wrote a book, Love and Sex with Robots, and so on. I guess one of the things I bring to this issue, though, is that concerns me. We even had the case of a Japanese man who formerly married an anime character. I don't know if you remember that story. But,
yes.
Strange things happen. But here's what bothers me the most about it. There are a lot of people out there, and I've encountered some of them, who really believe there is no essential difference between a living thing and something that appears to all intents and purposes to be alive. In other words, they can't acknowledge that your cat might, if you have one, might be different substantially from a robot that's made to behave like a cat. And it's a profound philosophical thing we can't address here. But what worries me is that sometimes I think that people are going to blur these boundaries, which, if taken to an extreme, is a kind of psychosis.
Yes, that's a very interesting thing. And on the issue of the question about animals and robots intersecting, I find that very intriguing. And, there's this, human beings we're pretty narcissistic creatures, and we tend to anthropomorphize anything around us that isn't human. In terms of our pets, for example, in this era compared to others and our culture compared to others in the world, we do tend to treat our pets as if they were little human beings. And some of that is not necessarily in the pet's interest. They see a dog seems to reflect human emotions. They may indeed have evolved to do that for survival purposes, to elicit warm and fuzzy human responses in order to get fed, etc. But they aren't human, and they have needs that are not the same as human needs, and they can suffer greatly when their essential difference is not recognized. So I think that's a really interesting thing. In terms of the ethical questions surrounding sex and romance with robots, one of the most interesting questions that I found had to do with pedophiles. There are some experts who think that a child robot, a robot in the form of a human child, might be a way of treating pedophiles. To assign them a robot, perhaps that would obviate the need for them to act out their impulses on human children. Now, that's a big question. Maybe it would. Maybe, on the other hand, it would amplify their predilection. It's really hard to know. I also suspect that in many cases, a pedophile's compulsion is in part driven by the interaction with a human being, the chase and the trust that's built with a child. And I don't think that experience is going to be the same with a robot. So I think people sometimes leap to conclusions, and as you point out, they don't necessarily take into account that there is a pretty essential difference between interacting with a robot and a human. I mean, the robot, for example, never says no. I mean, that's an essential component of that kind of relationship, whereas human beings are somewhat unpredictable. They have variable emotions and so on, and it's a much more complicated interaction.
Right. No, I think that's such a huge and interesting point. I think in terms of the issue of pedophilia, which you mentioned in your article, one of the valuable things about these types of debates or discussions for me is the self-reflection it forces. And so when someone says, well, let's just give a pedophile a child robot, many of us, and myself included, feel revulsion and horror, and that's a terrible thing to do. But if it were to make children safer, it's probably the moral thing to do. So I learned something about myself in reading that. I struggle with morality, which is how we grow. But B, I think you're absolutely right. And I think this is a point that gets lost in this whole discussion of sex, romance, and other relationships with robots, is that the humanity, for good or evil, I mean, in a pedophilia case, it's a dark thing, the pursuit and so on. But the fact that, in a healthy human being, I would argue that the emotional bonds with another human being, even in a casual relationship, and the making contact and the mutual persuasion and all that is part of the process. And just saying, initiate program, is in a sense sacrificing part of your humanity, no matter how realistic a simulation may be. But I fear, I mean, I don't know if it's harmful, but I wonder if many people feel the same way, or a lot of people would feel differently.
Yes, and there's another area that interests me, that got a topic that got raised in the comments on my article, which I had not really thought much about. I got a comment, for example, from a severely disabled man, and he said that he would very much prefer to have sexual relations with a human being, but he found it extremely difficult to get human beings to accept his condition, and therefore, as a substitute, he would welcome the opportunity to interact sexually with a robot. And that's a pretty poignant thing, I had to sit down and think about that man's experience. It's not just a titillating subject at that point. This is a very real human need that this man has that's not being met, and it is causing him a lot of distress and depression. There are also people out there who have severe shyness, mental challenges, emotional challenges that make relating with a human sexually very, very fraught and difficult, if not impossible. And so should they simply be sexless beings? Is there a way to incorporate robot sexuality into their lives and in a positive way? It's a question that I'm thinking about now, and I tend to think, well, if it helps them, why not?
Well, maybe we can update psychologist Abraham Maslow and come up with a hierarchy of robotic needs. And,
right.
maybe among them will be, look, if it's the only alternative, it's more humane than nothing, which I think we would say now. But as always, Lynn, thanks so much for joining us on these
Of course.
and talking about these very fascinating comments. Now you have a new piece on temporary marriage, which would also be fascinating, but we don't have time to get to it. So as always, Lynn Parramore, thanks for joining us.
Oh, it's always nice to talk to you.
Thank you.